Hello and welcome to the 2019 F1 Strategy Report, powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. My name's Michael Lamonato, and this is Round 7, the Canadian Grand Prix. Sebastian Vettel took the checkered flag, but in the season's hottest topic to date, lost the race to Lewis Hamilton after copping a 5-second time penalty. Was it fair? Was it racing? And what about all the other things that happened in this otherwise interesting Grand Prix? To help analyse the incident and so much more from the Canadian Grand Prix, I'm joined by Ted Kravitz from Sky Sports F1 and F1 TV. Ted, how you doing?
Hello, Michael. Yeah, not bad, thank you. Just off the plane this morning, back from Montreal. Spent some parts of the day napping because, of course, with the winds, it's always quicker coming back. It's 5.5, 6 hours from Montreal to the UK. But I came via Ottawa, which I found out was I kind of knew, but I found out was Canada's capital city. It's got a surprisingly small airport for a capital city of Canada, but there you go. It's probably like Australia, you know. It's Canberra. It's like it's some random city. They choose to have it as your capital. I don't really know why that is. Maybe something involving tax break or something. Why is Canberra capital city and not Sydney or Melbourne? By the way,
it's because it's between Sydney and Melbourne. Because the rivalry is so vicious that they could not possibly stomach the idea of a capital being in one of the other cities. So they made one up. Unfortunately, it's much closer to Sydney than it is to Melbourne, though. So many people still live in Sydney. I didn't know that fact about Ottawa, though, about Canada. Shows how much I know. I really should go to the Canadian Grand Prix sometime. An interesting race. We'll get, of course, to the main topic in a moment. But to set this one up, this was, for the first opportunity, really since Bahrain. And we could also talk about Azerbaijan, but we know why that went wrong for Ferrari. But let's say since Bahrain. The Ferrari appeared to have an opportunity to deliver that potential we thought they had in the pre-season. From practice, they looked quick. That turned out to be the case in qualifying as well. But I suppose we should caution here that this might not really be the Ferrari revival that Ferrari fans might be expecting, aside from the fact they didn't win the race. But this was very much more of a fact being a Ferrari circuit than anything else.
Yeah, and, you're right. And we shouldn't call it, it's hardly a revival when they're only going to work on, 4 or 5 circuits throughout the season. That being, long straights and where you need a really, really strong engine, and then small corners, slow speed corners where you don't really need such great aero. So Bahrain was one of them. Baku was the other one. Canada's one of them. And then arguably, Silverstone, no, that's got some slow corners, different mix of corners. And then Monza is going to be the last one. So it's not really a kind of car that's going to win you a championship. And let's face it, they're probably not going to win the championship. So, it is a bit disappointing that, they haven't been converted. They haven't been able to convert on what we thought was their good speed in Barcelona testing. Turned out not to be at all, and the Mercedes were just sorting themselves out and came and absolutely blitzed everybody. But it's a much better Mercedes than it was really last year, because they've got the compromise right. I think Toto Wolff said to me on the weekend, before we always went for a strong engine and low drag, and we changed the balance this year. The Mercedes changed the balance this year and decided, maybe they'll take a bit of drag to be quick through some slow corners as well, and it's really worked for them. It's such a dominant car, and that will lead us on to what I like to refer to as the incident at the Canadian Grand Prix, and what a nonsense the whole thing really was in that respect. That Mercedes is the dominant car, and let's be honest, they're going to win both championships unless something really, really weird happens. So that kind of puts a bigger picture onto the factor onto the whole thing for me.
Well, I strangely enough, I think that might be the first time on this program it's been openly admitted. We've been talking about it perhaps in hushed tones, but yeah, I think we can say they're probably going to win the championships. We'll talk about Valtteri Bottas later on. Hopefully something will happen there. Just to touch on that balance that Mercedes has found with this car, this was also the round they brought their first engine upgrade. Ferrari also brought some updates to this round after bringing their Spec 2 engine to Barcelona a couple of rounds ago, and essentially a month earlier than planned. And interesting to note, and of course there's more to straight line speed than just engine performance. Drag levels, of course, play a role in this direct comparison between Mercedes and Ferrari, but it was really interesting to see the qualifying comparison between Hamilton and Vettel, for example, that Mercedes was losing so much in a relative sense. They're talking about in the realm of more than half a second, 0.6 seconds, down that long back straight. And that was enough to swing the difference and deliver Sebastian Vettel pole.
Yeah, when we get to a circuit where, you're blessed with, or Ferrari were blessed with that long back straight, for the engine and the power unit, and the ERS to just pull and keep on going. And I think it's true, Mercedes still don't really know how Ferrari are doing this, because is it converting the energy from the MGUH, the turbine that runs off the turbo? Is it that's more efficient? I think it must be, because that's unlimited in the terms of the amount of energy that you can harvest is unlimited through the MGUH. So Ferrari must be finding a way to pump like crazy energy from that turbo into the MGUK. That's the turbine, the motor that runs straight into the engine, and take all that energy and kick it right into the engine through the MGUK and boost that car down the straight. And it's something Ferrari can do. They've found a way to do it, and Mercedes still don't know. So, that was the benefit that the Ferrari had in Canada. And you said, yeah, that's where it all started. All started in qualifying. That Vettel did, the lap he needed to do. Leclerc disappointed somewhat. Bottas disappointed very much with a spin, but it was Hamilton who, with one of his typically good Lewis laps, as Niki Lauda and Toto Wolff would record it, got in there and managed to get on the front row. And how crucial was that to the race and the incident, as I refer to it once again, that happened later on?
Well, exactly. This set up the incident. Well, the start, Hamilton got away cleanly from the start, despite having some pre-race concerns, some hydraulic leak in the garage, and then they had to bleed the brakes on the grid, and even an anti-stall problem when he got away for the formation lap. But he started fine, chased Vettel for the first stint, wasn't able to overcut him, as was the thinking if you're going to switch from the medium to the hards as they did, because of course they used the mediums in Q2. But on the hard tyre, Mercedes seemed to find that pace, and now it started to feel almost like it was going to be inevitable that we might see Lewis Hamilton launching a move on Sebastian Vettel. Couldn't get close down that straight, as we said, because the Ferrari just had such prodigious straight line speed, but we got to lap 49, about 10 laps after Hamilton really closed down that gap and started challenging. And we reached that incident at turns 3 and 4, where Vettel cut across the grass into turn 4 after having a bit of a snap of oversteer. And I guess we should say, and maybe this is where we need to start using the language Sebastian Vettel does not like, start using couched legal terms, but almost hit Lewis Hamilton, I suppose we should say, and the stewards eventually judged that to be a penalty. Before we sort of consider, why this happened, how this happened, should it have happened, what was your take on that incident? This is the hot topic of probably the next fortnight, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, we should start, well, first of all, I should start by saying when I'm going to refer to the incident and my personal feelings about it, I am just talking as, a personal Ted Kravitz, personal Formula One fan, not Ted Kravitz, reporter for Sky Sports or F1 TV or anything like that. Okay, so I'm not talking I'm talking very much from a personal point of view. So disclaimer time, first of all. Second of all, we should bear in mind, of course, that Hamilton, because he was so quick, well, no, rather it's impressive that he was so quick on that hard tyre, given that he didn't do any long runs on it on Friday, because he put his car into the wall. So that was the first thing that really surprised me. I kind of expected Hamilton not to have such great race pace because he hadn't had that Friday practice. So all credit to Lewis for actually being able to, to throw off that deficit that most people believe if you don't actually get the chance to do your homework on the tyres. Bottas, of course, had the homework done, and they knew that the hard tyre would be a good one for them. But that was the first thing I thought was impressive. And then we got to the fact that he was threatening Vettel, and Vettel by the evidence of Friday, wasn't as quick on the long runs as Mercedes. And that's exactly the way it turned out. He was a bit struggling. And the crucial thing is that Vettel was having to save fuel. So that was the cryptic radio message from Riccardo Adami, Vettel's engineer, to him on the radio. He says, "Do you remember?" He said, "The numbers on your dash are correct. Take appropriate action." We speculated it might have been brake temperatures or fuel numbers. It was fuel numbers. Vettel explained it that he thought that they weren't ostensibly underfueled compared to Mercedes, although we might have been. We'll probably never find that out. It's just that with Lewis running in Vettel's slipstream for large parts of the race, he didn't use as much fuel as Sebastian did. So that was the thing. So Vettel was already having to save a little bit of fuel. So that's why Lewis was catching him. Vettel was pushing. He made a mistake. He went across the grass. He kept his foot in it. He didn't, swerve away and recover safely and allow Lewis through because he's racing. And that was it. So, I mean, where do you want to start? The fact that it was investigated in the first place, that's an interesting point.
It is. I mean, it is interesting. I suppose the way the investigation process works, isn't it, is that the race director refers it to the stewards to decide, and maybe at that point they had nothing to do and wanted to investigate it. It is surprising. I mean, and that's what Ferrari's appealing as well. I suppose we should say this. Talk about them appealing is not so much the penalty, but the fact that it's being investigated in the first place. It's extremely divisive. I can see where the regulation is being applied to begin with. And I guess, in my opinion, you can't separate the chase Lewis Hamilton was applying to the end of the incident. It's one long incident of Hamilton applying pressure and Vettel braking. So from that perspective, I can kind of understand this penalty, I suppose. Maybe a bit too many seconds, but I can kind of understand why Hamilton should have been ahead at that point.
No, sure. And to be totally fair to the stewards, and I imagine that, Emanuele Pirro, because I think he's the only one with a Twitter account out of the four people, is probably getting a bit of stick from people. But strictly speaking, the stewards can't take into account what I referred to earlier as the bigger picture. So they can't take into account the fact that, it would be good for Formula One if we get a different winner. It would be good for the championship. And, this isn't exactly going to, if it is a close call, it's probably not going to be too contentious, in that it's probably not, this decision probably isn't going to decide the world championship, as I referred to earlier. So the stewards can't take into any of those bigger picture issues into account. That's up to the race director to have that in the back of his mind, use his experience and think, am I going to refer this or not? Or do I think, for the better image of Formula One, using my experience, I don't think I will. I think I'll note it. Maybe I'll have a word with Sebastian afterwards, but I'll probably let this go. Now, it is an open discussion as to whether Charlie Whiting would have let this go, and whether Michael Massey, in his first few months in the job, was minded not to let it go. I don't know. I don't think any of us can know. Would Charlie have let it go? Well, I tell you what. Evidence would suggest that Charlie Whiting wouldn't have let it just go, and would have done exactly the same as Michael Massey did, because he didn't let it go when Max Verstappen pushed Kimi Räikkönen wide, or didn't give Kimi Räikkönen the space. I think it was coming out of the triangle chicane, the last corner in Suzuka last year. Max rejoined the track and sort of pushed Kimi wide, or didn't give Kimi the space, and Max got precisely the same penalty that Lewis got, and that was what the stewards referred to when they were deciding which penalty to give. They said, okay, and they've got a huge database. The way this works, the stewards have a massive database of naughty stuff. They type into the database, rejoining the track and not leaving a gap. It comes up, Suzuka 2018, Max and Kimi, they have a look at it and they say, yeah, it was like that, or it wasn't like that. that's the precedent, that's what we're going to give. So that's what would happen. So, you can discuss whether you like, whether Charlie would have referred to it before. The fact is, Charlie did refer something like that before. So, okay, maybe you can put that argument, was it over-regulation, maybe a nervousness on Michael Massey's part to do the right thing, etc., etc. You can put that to bed. Now, the other thing, was Massey prompted to investigate it, or prompted it to refer it to the stewards by the Mercedes team? Was Mercedes prompted to do that by Lewis Hamilton being on the radio and having a little whinge about it? And they are open questions, aren't they? Because it is a fact, we heard it, that Lewis was on the radio and said, hey, he pushed me wide. I can't remember if we actually heard the response, but they would have said yes, we noted it, or we're on to the FIA or whatever. But in that case, were they fishing for a penalty? Did that have an effect? Did that have a consequence? And they are open questions. What I said on TV on the weekend was that if they were, it's something that happens all the time. I mean, all the time. Even Romain Grosjean, when he got overtaken, quite firmly, but pretty fairly by Sergio Perez in the race, he got on and had a little whinge on the radio saying, oh, that was ridiculous. He pushed me off, complained. And maybe Haas did complain. But maybe at that point, Michael Massey thought, oh, do you know what? I think that's okay. I'm not going to refer to it. So that is the question, isn't it? Why did Michael Massey think, I don't think that's okay. I will refer that. And was there pressure from a big team like Mercedes, a big driver like Lewis Hamilton, who didn't think that was fair? And was Massey influenced by that in thinking, well, if Lewis thinks it's a problem, if Mercedes thinks it's a problem, then I think it's a problem and I will refer it to the stewards? They are open questions.
It's such a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, isn't it? Because the context of this, and there are precedential examples, as we talked about with Suzuka last year, Max Verstappen and Kimi Raikkonen as one. And probably there are examples that you could argue where it wasn't referred, but this idea that comes up, I feel like it's come up a couple of times this season as well, that, stewarding is not consistent or decisions are not consistent. Sure, the stewards panel itself is not consistent in the sense that it's rotating. So you could say that, well, even despite the system, the catalogue system they have, that different opinions are naturally going to find their way into the process. But surely the best way to find consistency is to ensure that decisions are made in the first place, I guess. Because equally, I mean, who knows, I guess the incident itself was small enough that probably had no decision been made, no one would really have talked about it afterwards, unless, Lewis Hamilton was very upset at the end, being unable to find a way past. But at least we have a consistency in the sense that an incident, by the definition of the regulations, is at least investigated, even if the outcome is not exactly what made most people happy.
No, definitely. I mean, it was, the consistency was there. It was absolutely there. I mean, you could argue that, Verstappen's on Kimi was a little bit more calculated. I don't know. I mean, you could argue that maybe they took into account that, Verstappen had been a bit naughty throughout 2018 and maybe that influenced it. I don't know. But, certainly Verstappen's one was, as I remember it, a little bit more deliberate in that he didn't go across the grass. He went across tarmac runoff, having missed the chicane. He didn't have grass on his tyres, and he wasn't ostensibly trying to keep control of his car. And Vettel was. And so I think if you were going to say that it's inconsistent, that would be the only thing you could pin it on, is to say that Verstappen, there was obviously, or you could argue, it might be your opinion, we have to be careful, that you could say that, Verstappen had the intention to push Kimi wide to make sure that Kimi went off the track and he wouldn't attack him and take his place down into the Suzuka's first corner. I don't think Sebastian Vettel's intention was to push Lewis in or near the wall. The only intention that Seb had at the moment was making sure that he actually kept control of his car and carried on. Okay, it was convenient because he kept his foot in that he could keep Lewis behind, but I think the intention is important here, and I don't think it was a mean intention, but I might be reading a bit too much into that. What do you think?
I'm inclined to agree. I don't think there was any malicious intention on Sebastian Vettel's part. But I mean, again, for me, it comes back to that idea that he made a mistake because he was put under pressure. And then in recovering from his mistake, I know it's a word that Sebastian Vettel doesn't like, but disadvantaged Lewis Hamilton as he was trying to pass him, even if it's unintentional. And so I can see why the balance of the situation, a steward might feel that it ought to be corrected, even if it was not a malicious maneuver to run him out of road or run him against the barrier or whatever. I can see all of the criteria meeting those regulations there, and I can see the reasoning for it. But hey, maybe you could argue a 2-second penalty, which I think they would have the power to apply if I understand the regulations. There's just an open time penalty. Maybe that would have been a fairer call. It's hard to say, though. I mean, then you got to make that decision within a certain amount of time, and there's arguments maybe they should decide them after the race, which I can understand, because then you can put cases. But then what happens with a podium, and it ends up being an even messier situation. So it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one that's, as much as it's made over several laps, it's still made fairly quickly, and someone's got to go with their instinct, I suppose.
Yeah. No. I mean, you're right. You're right in. There's certainly one thing that's absolutely 100% correct, is that Sebastian Vettel made another mistake. Whether you want to add the words under pressure, they're always under pressure, but he did make another mistake. An understandable mistake, yes, a bit more understandable perhaps than the one in Bahrain when he spun, or Monza when he spun, or Japan when he spun, or was it Suzuka, wasn't it? Spa. Yes, a bit more understandable, but I think what really comes down to it is just that it shouldn't have been, someone should give Michael Massey maybe other things to do during a race, He's just oh, well, I was reading the paper, oh yeah, that seems fine, I mean, I said as a fan, the over-regulation at the moment is killing the sport, and that's certainly what Sebastian Vettel said afterwards. He feels exactly the same way. And to make sure that you don't have to put it to the stewards, so that you're not forcing them to follow the precedent and do their jobs, which they did, you just don't refer it to them in the first place. You roll your eyes, you say, I think that was okay, and you fold your arms and you carry on watching the race because it's a good race, and just let them do it.
It's a debate that will go on forever, especially on Twitter, where people are really getting completely out of control, in my opinion. But no, Formula One's not dead yet. It's okay. It'll be all right. We'll come back. You'll all be watching again in France, and it'll be fine. Someone did race me. Well, what happens if Mercedes wins all the races now? We're going to look back on this one, and it's going to be disappointing. But I don't think this one would make a difference in that case. So I think we'll be okay. We'll all be fine. Our podcasts can continue, I think, is what I'm saying. The background, not of this incident itself, but we talked about the way that the tyres were being used in this situation, right? Lewis Hamilton was finding great pace on those hards, even despite not himself running in practice. I guess some of that credit can go to Valtteri Bottas. Ferrari, though, had not the kind of problems they've been having with their tyres over the last couple of races, but still had sort of a background of that. Even in qualifying, I think Sebastian Vettel mentioned that the start of his laps were not quite as good as the end because the tyre warm-up was still a bit of a problem. I thought it was interesting in Canada as well that there's this talk that some of the teams, including Ferrari and Red Bull Racing, have been trying to count the numbers among themselves to see if they can lobby for a mid-season compound change, which would have a pretty dramatic effect on strategy and even just the way teams approach weekends going forward, given it would be a change in the middle of the year.
I know, this is a great story. I love this. This comes under the category of good luck with that. So it's a classic Helmut Marko idea, in that they are always him, Christian Horner, to a lesser extent, I suppose, Mattia Binotto, but they're always looking at political ways that they can use to make their cars quicker, whether it's a rule change, a clarification on engine maps, or anything like that. If they're not winning, they are thinking, sitting there, scheming over a lunch somewhere or a dinner, how can we disadvantage this team who is winning? How can we stop them winning? And they've come up with the idea of let's change the tyres in the middle of a season. Not been done before, except on a basis of either safety or, we got runaway tyre blistering problems that we need to change. God bless them for having a go at it. Not going to happen. But, it is, I'm not sure how much the balance is between Red Bull pushing for this and Ferrari pushing for this. Obviously, it would advantage Ferrari. But, people refer to, of course, these narrower, these thinner tyres. Last year they advantaged Mercedes, and this year they're advantaging Mercedes. Well, two things on that. First of all, we had these thinner tyres at Silverstone, and Sebastian Vettel in a Ferrari won Silverstone. Let's not forget. And second of all, and I checked this with Mario Isola from Pirelli, all the teams had these precise compound construction and thinner tyres in the Abu Dhabi test at the end of last year. They all tried them. They all knew what was going to happen. Yes, it was last year's cars, not this year's cars. But if they didn't get it right, they've only got themselves to blame. And the weird thing is, there's a sort of, imagine a sort of two paths of a graph. One, team by team, they were always making, over the winter, they thought, well, we always want to try and make our car easier on its tyres because, that tends to be the way you can win races, by doing fewer stops, being kinder on your tyres. And the progress of that, went up. And the graph on that went up. If you imagine a graph went up. And at the same time, Pirelli were working on, well, we must try and make our tyres less sensitive so that the teams don't need to look after our tyres so much, And that, level of sensitivity went from a high point to a low point on the same graph. And, there's a point in the middle when they cross. And I think Mercedes are in that point in the middle of the cross. But Red Bull and Ferrari have made cars that are much easier on their tyres than Mercedes, and it's hurting them. And it's made, it's worked against them rather than for them. And I think that's the frustrating thing from certainly Horner and Marco's point of view, and I suppose for Binotto's point of view as well. It's like, look, Pirelli, we did our bit. We thought we were doing what's right, and you go and bring this tyre now that you absolutely have to, muller like a crazy thing to get it to work. And even a place like Baku, they're dropping off and freezing off and becoming stone cold. So we needn't have bothered trying to make our cars easy on your tyres, because now you've got to make the tyres, need to be worked hard to actually get in their temperature window. So I can understand their frustration. I think that's where it comes from, trying to get this rule change. But yeah, it's not going to happen.
I would hate to be Mario Isola to be confronted by Gunther Steiner at this point in the season, to be honest, because surely he would be in the change camp.
Although Gunther Steiner has got his own human resources issues to deal with, hasn't he? In Kevin Magnussen, who was a bit naughty. He got a bit of a talking to after Barcelona, didn't he?
Yeah.
I think Gunther was a little bit on Roman's side, even though, as anybody who's not watched the Netflix show knows, Gunther has referred to Roman as a whinger before. I think when Roman complained about Kevin in the Spanish Grand Prix, Gunther was very much on Grosjean's side. And then again, with the brilliant radio message, I have never, ever driven such an awful car, had such a terrible experience, can't remember what it was word for word. And he got a pretty strong, it wasn't the shut up that he said to Grosjean once, Gunther Steiner, but it was something close to that. But that was good stuff. So yeah, maybe Steiner's got his own issues to rather than chasing down the poor put upon Mario Isola, who I do feel a bit sorry for. But I tell you what, having spoken to him, he is putting up a pretty strong defence of his time.
There are a couple of other drivers worth speaking about in this field who didn't crash into one another, or nearly crash into one another, who weren't penalised, let's put it that way. We've talked a little bit about Charles Leclerc, who's just a little bit off the pace, ran pretty much the same strategy, but Valtteri Bottas, in what we could term the beginning of a segment called Disappointment Corner or something similar, he got stuck behind Renault's, which there's two different ways to approach this, I suppose. The first being that in a Mercedes, he really should have gotten past some Renault cars. The second was that this really illustrates how good a race Renault has finally had, 7 rounds into the season, not had any technical problems, except when Nico Hülkenberg, I think, briefly thought his gearbox was about to explode, but it didn't, so that's okay. He was one driver who, I mean, if we're talking about the championship staying alive, this was a poor round for that kind of optimism.
It was. Two things here. First of all, well done Renault for, you remember the power unit problems they had earlier in the year, and they did have to turn the engines down. They've now turned them up again, and they are A, powerful, and B, reliable. So well done Renault. That's good stuff. And B, it's all down to qualifying. That mistake that Valtteri Bottas made that put him well down the grid and having to deal with, Daniel Ricciardo and thanks to a good start, Nico Hülkenberg. That meant he was in dirty air. That meant his engine started to overheat, and that meant a slower pit stop while they pulled off two little strips on the cooling vents either side of the halo head protection, which they can just pull off. It's a quick change to the car's cooling, which it's a nice idea. It's on both Mercedes, and they did need to activate that, pull off those little tear-off strips to give extra cooling to Bottas's power unit, which was overheating, stuck behind Hülkenberg, I think it was. So, and the fact Hülkenberg went, much further on his soft tyres than Mercedes ever thought they were going to. And of course, Bottas got through Q2 on the medium tyre, didn't he? So he was always going to have a longer stint. But Renault really did stitch up Bottas's race quite significantly. But I don't know, is it a silver lining that he got 1 point, an extra point for the fastest lap?
I mean, he'd have to look at it like that, I suppose, because there wasn't much else to get too excited about this round for Valtteri Bottas. I mean, they said that, or Toto Wolff said that, Monaco would be a little bit of a wake-up call, and Spain as well, and now Valtteri Bottas is saying this is a wake-up call of a round. We certainly need him to wake up if he's indeed not yet awake, because we're relying on him, really, at this point, to turn this championship into a bit of competition. But, I mean, if Valtteri was disappointed this round, peak disappointment, I guess, really goes to Pierre Gasly. Talk about getting stuck behind not just the Renaults, but even the Racing Point of Lance Stroll. Stroll had a good race, we'll mention in a moment, but this was a big opportunity for Pierre because started ahead of Max Verstappen, out-qualified him. Yes, Verstappen had the problem in Q2 because of Kevin Magnussen's crash, but nonetheless. And instead, what essentially happened was that they reversed positions. Verstappen finished fifth when Gasly qualified fifth, and Gasly dropped down to eighth when Verstappen started ninth. Look, they dismissed rumours that Gasly was under pressure. Some more spurious rumours, I guess we could call them, but this is not really helping anybody trying to dispel them.
Gasly's definitely under pressure in terms of putting in some results. I'm not sure if he's under pressure in terms of his drive, because who will they replace him with? The talk was maybe Nico Hülkenberg, all right, maybe. I mean, that's a bit of a long shot. Alex Albon is not ready to step up from Toro Rosso, by his own admission. And Danny Kvyat is probably not willing because that didn't work out too well the last time. Although they might, think, okay, well, third time's a charm. And if you can get over having us having sacked you before, then, Danny will give it another go. But he might do, because he's very much a different driver now, Danny Kvyat, than he was when his services were dispensed with by Red Bull Racing first time around. But such is the pit lane and the other team's low esteem of Gasly's performances that they think that he's easy meat. So, I checked this with Renault afterwards, and they said, look, we knew we could get Gasly. I was like, how did you know you could get Gasly? And I said, well, hang on, did you think you'd be able to get a finish ahead of Verstappen? They were like, oh, no, we knew Verstappen was going to pass us. Well, they're in identical cars and Verstappen's starting behind you. How did you know that? But I mean, that's absolutely how they think. The other teams are relentless, indiscriminate. They are horrible if a driver isn't having, a particularly fine season. They are just ready to take advantage of that, and that's kind of what happened with Pierre Gasly. And we haven't seen really yet, have we, a fighting drive from him. He's had some decent results, he's scored some decent points, but they've largely been unchallenged, haven't they? When other people around him have had bad weekends, and now we have both Renaults having a good weekend, and then Gasly gets beaten by them. So, not great.
Compared, of course, with his teammate Max Verstappen, which is in general a difficult comparison when you're up against a driver so quick. But in specifically the case of this race, Verstappen did have, well, I suppose the better strategy considering where he started from anyway. Starting on the hard tyre, running quite long, stopping on lap 48. and that delivered him past the Renaults. He had to pass them in the end, but he did that very quickly. It was not even a battle worth speaking about. But this strategy proved to be the correct one for anyone starting further back, as Lance Stroll, I think, proved to the greatest effect. Started all the way down in 17th and scored a couple of points, not even just one. Relied on a pass on Carlos Sainz at the end as Sainz was running out of tyres, having stopped only on lap 3 or very early in the race. But nonetheless, this was a very strong result from Lance Stroll after his 11th consecutive Q1 elimination, and showed that there is something in that car that is worth racing for, even if they're not really extracting it consistently.
It was great stuff from Lance Stroll, and he can put in these fantastic performances on his day. I like to think he was well motivated by the Lance Stroll grandstand, and you know what this is. So I don't know if you know but for people who don't know the geography of the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve on the Ile Notre Dame in Montreal. It's horrible to get around by car because it's just one long sort of strip of land. And so you have to, when you come in, if you're parking in the paddock, which is the other side of the rowing lake, you have to go in past the grandstands on the left-hand side of the casino hairpin, and then it comes round and you go onto the sort of towpath, which is on the right-hand side of the casino grandstand. And that is where, if you look out the right-hand side of your car, as every paddock person does, if you're driving to the car park, you see the Lance Stroll grandstand. And it's huge. And the signage on it was huge. And it's this big thing, it said Lance Stroll, and it had his LS logo on it, and it's massive. And I thought, as I was passing it on Sunday morning, what a motivating factor that must be, to drive past it and see your name on these massive grandstands. And I like to think that he got fired up on Sunday morning. He came in, he said, you know what, they've built this, they've had these signs made, this awning they put on the back of this temporary grandstand, or the scaffolding, I'm going to deliver for them. And I'm sure the people who bought a ticket in the Lance Stroll grandstand probably didn't know that, but they, if they're Canadian, they're proud of their sportsmen, they'll be happy if I do a good race as well. But all credit to them. Good strategy as well. I think they were sort of fishing for a safety car later in the race, and starting on the hard tyres would allow them to do that, to keep their window open as long as possible, and maybe profit from a cheap pit stop under a safety car. But in the end, they didn't need it, did they? They did not need it. And he managed to get Carlos Sainz, as you say, one of the two victims of the phantom crash helmet visor tear-off sprayer. Who was this person who was depositing helmet visor tear-offs that got stuck in both Kimi Räikkönen's rear brake caliper and Carlos Sainz's rear brake caliper? What? Who was this, and what are the chances of these things getting stuck there? I mean, Kimi does tend to tear his off at pit stops, and I think sometimes I remember that they found it was one of his because it had a Finnish flag on the side. I seem to remember there was some radio message, I think it was to Kimi, or it might have been to another driver, says, yes, we had to stop you again because you had an overheating brake duct because of a visor in there. The visor tear-off was yours. Try and dispose of it, in a better way, or keep it in, the glove box in the cockpit of the car. Not there is a glove box, I know that. But yeah, I mean, that was almost going to be a rule. Do you remember last year? I think it was. There was going to be a rule that forbids drivers to throw out driver helmet tear-off strips outside the car, and people were going to have to, the race suit manufacturers were looking at making a little pocket on the top of the leg by the knee, where the driver could tear off his visor tear-off strip, and then tuck it in this little pocket in a sort of easily accessible place on his leg. But in the end, that rule didn't come in. I wonder if they'll revisit that after Sainz and Räikkönen's races were ruined by the phantom helmet visor tear-off distributor.
Not even the first time. I'm pretty sure Kimi Räikkönen had the same problem in Australia from memory, and that completely decided the midfield battle. So what are the chances of it happening twice to the same driver in one season?
Well, maybe it was his own. Maybe it was his own.
Maybe it's a strategy. Who knows? Maybe it's part of his approach to racing. It's difficult to say. So in the end, Carlos Sainz lost some places because he ran such a long stint. It was ambitious. It almost worked. Had it not been for maybe 3 laps, it only had happened a couple of laps later because he changed on lap 3, had to run 67, if my maths is correct. Yep, so on that hard tyre, and it really just sort of started giving up in those last 3 laps, and he got passed not only by Stroll, but then by Daniel Kvyat, who took the final point of the race. And just by way of comparison, we talk about Lance Stroll having the correct strategy. Sergio Perez had, I guess, the opposite. He started ahead, much like Gasly started ahead of Verstappen and they swapped. Perez started ahead, but stopped on only lap 11 off the medium onto the hards and couldn't really make too much of it after that. And I suppose that really showed which direction the very warm Montreal weather was pushing the tyre strategy in. Early stops were not really rewarded, unless you were a Renault driver.
Yeah, I kind of was a bit baffled by Checo Perez's performance, given that he's, historically been very strong around here. I did later find out that he had flat spotted those tyres and had a pretty serious vibration, and had to really slow down because of that. So I did find Otmar Zafnauer in the paddock afterwards, who was a little bit disappointed that Sergio Perez couldn't make a bit more of it. But yeah, well done, Danny Kvyat. Saved a point for Toro Rosso at a race where they thought they weren't going to get any, and made it, 3 of the 4 Honda Power cars scored points, and the only one that didn't conked out because they wanted to save some engine mileage after, the clash, the Albon pinch on the first lap when he was pinched between Giovinazzi and I think it was Perez. I think Perez and Giovinazzi pinched Albon, and poor Alex lost his nose cone. But that just underlines, and sometimes I don't think we make enough of the Honda engine turnaround. At an engine track that we had Verstappen in the points, Gasly in the points, Kvyat in the points. I'm not sure they're getting enough credit. Maybe it's because people think, well, you should have been doing this a long time ago, but they weren't, and they were so woeful for so long that it just underlines what a good job they've done now.
Absolutely, and that'll presumably only continue to improve throughout the year, and we'll have another assessment at Monza, I suppose. Both Honda and Renault looking more or less on par as predicted, and not so far, not a million miles away from the front anymore, which is, of course, good for Formula One. Was this race good for Formula One? Hey, it got everyone talking on Twitter, even if they're all talking about how they're never going to watch another race again. I don't believe them.
Well, do you know what? I have conflicted. I'm not sure I agree with you. I think there will be some people who are genuinely put off. Just in this concept of in this health and safety mad world that we live in, and your home country, being part of it, the concept of mateship seems to have slightly gone out the window in Australia, as the health and safety mad. Although I wish there would be a little bit more security conscious, certainly in your inner cities. The inability of anybody to leave a locked pedal bike to a bike rack in Melbourne town centre is completely impossible, such as the spate of bike thieves, the problem that you've got in Melbourne, which unfortunately I was affected by. So I think if they can just ease it off a bit, don't have such strong regulation in Formula One, it would be the better for the sport, because anyone is going to get put off. I wouldn't want anyone to get put off by this over-regulation. And maybe that's a sign, and I think maybe we will have a positive outcome consequence of this, that maybe people will think, maybe Michael Massey will think, I won't refer these things in the future, and we'll get a bit more light regulation.
We'll see how that pans out. We've got a couple more races, of course, till we really hit that run of European Grand Prix and then the mid-season break. Maybe that'll end up being a time for Formula One to reflect. But hey, we look forward to the next race nonetheless. But thank you so much, Ted Kravitz, for joining us to look back on certainly an interesting Canadian Grand Prix.
Yep, no problem. Enjoyed it. Thanks.
That was Ted Kravitz from Sky Sports F1 and F1 TV. The Strategy Report is powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. Play it for free on iOS and Android devices. You can get every episode of The Strategy Report by subscribing on Google and Apple Podcasts, Spotify, your favourite podcasting app, and all of your socials. And if you like what you've heard, we'd love it if you could give us a rating and a review to help more F1 fans find the show. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast, and if you're looking for a less serious look back at the Canadian Grand Prix after all of that analysis, have a search for Box of Neutrals in your podcasting app of choice to hear Rob, James and I implore the Twitter world to stay calm. After all, it's just a race. I've been Michael Lamonato. Look me up at Michael Lamonato on Twitter, and I'll catch you in 2 weeks' time for an analysis of the French Grand Prix.